He says the free market system he championed has been captured by the people it was supposed to discipline. That growth no longer translates into human flourishing. That the institutions we trusted to keep the game fair are now the ones rigging it. And he says the framework he spent his entire career defending can't fix what it itself helped to break. So, what do you do when your own side's ideology becomes part of the problem? Well, to find out the answer to that question, won't you join me on this episode of The Big Questions? I'm Big John. Let's go. We are the wealthiest society in human history, more than any people who ever lived. And yet, we're miserable, lonelier, more anxious. The system might be working, but the sense is it's not working for us. My guest today has spent decades defending the free market. Then he changed his mind, not necessarily because capitalism failed, but because a small group of people have figured out how to break it. Brink Lindsey calls it the captured economy. I call it a problem we haven't been honest enough to talk about until now. This is The Big Questions with Big John, and my guest today is Brink Lindsey. Brink, thank you for joining me today.
John, thanks for having me on.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. And what I find fascinating is, at least initially, as I was, obviously I was familiar with some of your work online, is when I look into your history, you've gone on a journey, both philosophically and perhaps on your worldview. Initially, and I want you to talk about it, is you started out as what I would call a classical liberal or a libertarian in general terms, and you've kind of migrated to where you are today, which we're going to talk about a little bit more in depth. Can you just initially maybe tell me what drew you to say initially to the libertarian philosophy, to the classical liberal outlook on the world?
So I have a very stock libertarian, origin story, which is I read Ayn Rand in high school. This was back in the late 70s during the melees of the Carter administration, when lots of people were talking about the world falling apart. So the narrative grabbed me, and I was an enthusiast from the time I finished that book. I, after a few years, discovered the work of Friedrich Hayek, which I found at that time I was ready for it, and it hit me that here was someone who was defending a free society from philosophical grounds almost diametrically opposed to those of Ayn Rand. Ayn Rand said we have absolute certainty about what is right and wrong, and we can deduce from first principles what we ought to do. Whereas Hayek's case for liberty was based on our ignorance, that each person has such a tiny grasp of the knowledge that is necessary to sustain his or her life that no small group of people is in any kind of position to direct things from the center. So by the time I read him, that struck me as a kind of more realistic starting point. So from my mid-20s until sometime in the last 15 years or so, I considered myself a kind of Hayekian classical liberal, or I was a professional libertarian at the Cato Institute for 20 plus years. And I still am, a believer in the power of the basic libertarian insights. I think they still have weight, and I think they're still on net underappreciated in the world. So, and those insights are the suspicion of centralized power. That's a perennial good idea. Awareness of the immense creativity of bottom-up spontaneous activity, especially when mediated through competitive markets, an alertness to and a real acute awareness of all the ways that government can go badly wrong, even with the best intentions. So I think all these are partial truths. They're not the whole story. I used to think they were close enough to the whole story that was good enough for policy work. I over the course of the 20 so when the libertarian movement arose in the 60s and 70s, the alignment between those partial truths and the needs of the world, I think, was very good. The advanced democracies had all been through decades of just rapid growth of government with very naive kind of enthusiasm about the possibilities of technocratic control. Meanwhile, a third of the people on Earth lived under regimes that thought that the competitive market should be banished from economic life. So I think the sort of balance to the political debate that the rise of libertarianism brought about was healthy. By the early, as we moved into the 21st century, I felt that less and less, that there were big challenges to which smaller government and lower taxes just didn't seem like a very useful response. So, Irving Kristol, one of the original neoconservatives back in the 1970s, was asked to define neoconservatives, define a neoconservative, and he said a neoconservative is a liberal who just got mugged by reality. Yes. I don't know what to call myself anymore, but I'm a libertarian who got mugged by the 21st century.
And that's interesting because I could see how the way you've described your journey, like from Ayn Rand to Hayek, going from her objectivist outlook on life to someone who said, hey, there's a pretense of knowledge. Nobody knows. No one person knows what's going on, which I find very relatable. But at some point, I guess what you're saying is the reality of what you saw around you just didn't match up. Whether that was because, now, do you think that's because libertarianism is inherently flawed? Is it because it got taken advantage of, if I could use that term? Or do you feel that it inherently has shortcomings that get us like 80% of the way there, but can't get us across the finish line?
So there's a couple of things. Just in the evolution of my own thinking, I've just gotten soured generally on the idea of kind of one ism being robust enough to be a useful map for the whole territory of political experience. And the idea that there is one master value that trumps all, that you can solve all political problems because you know what the relative weights are of these different competing values. And so liberty always wins, and so you always know what the right answer is. So there's liberty, security, equality, stability. These all matter to human beings, and so I've come to think that the best and they're incommensurable. They don't come down. There's no common denominator that you can maximize. So I've come to think that the best we can do in political life is achieve a kind of rough balance amongst the values that matter. And I very much believe that is best done through a classically liberal framework. That is with a polity based on a competitive market economy, popular self-government under the rule of law, policy making by evidence and persuasion. Those are all core values for me. Still, I just don't put the sort of ideological limits in advance on what I think an appropriate government response to a problem is right now. I'm less, I'm just less absolutist about about liberty always trumping, and I'm also have come to think that the libertarian conception of freedom, where really the only enemy worth worrying about is the state, is too simplistic. That really we experience unfreedom from above, from the state, but the lot of mankind through most of history was to experience a lot of unfreedom from below, from social structures that pinched very narrowly and that oppressed. I think that can happen without coercion. I think cultural power can be oppressive. But but still, I still consider myself classically liberal, and I've seen a lot of libertarians in this disordered time lurch towards Trumpism, and I've seen other ones lurch towards wokeism. So it's been hard for anybody to keep their heads in recent years.
Right. And if we were to put the political labels aside, because a lot of what you just said about is less political the way I heard it, right? It's less about the Libertarian Party or the Republican Party or the Democratic Party in the US, right? But it's almost like you're describing a human condition. And do you think it's a case of as we move along as a society, as a species, we just have to understand what it is we're moving towards? So, for example, you hear a lot about the obesity epidemic in the United States. Much like myself, I'm overweight, and all that. And I say, well, in some ways, that's a good thing, right? Because that shows me that we've progressed to the point where I'm not worried about where my next meal is coming from.
Right.
I'm not worried about starving on the street, by and large. I mean, obviously, there's still extreme poverty in the world, especially if you look at it globally. But let's focus on the United States for a second. Yeah, I'm fatter because I don't have to worry about where my next meal is coming from. And in some ways, that's a good thing, right? Because you look at the progress we've made where humans can now say, I don't have to wake up, like our most Christian prayers, will thank their God for their daily bread, right? Because that was a real concern at one point.
Sure.
Where am I going to find my food? So do you feel this is just part of the human condition, or is it tied to a political system? I mean, it sounds to me like you're leaning more towards the former, right?
Yeah. So I think, really since industrialization started, and maybe even before that, since the scientific revolution sort of, created this qualitative shift in the way we encounter the outside world. Uh, we've been, but certainly since industrialization that has remade our physical environment beyond recognition, we are on the frontiers of human experience. Nobody has done this before, right? So nobody, and industrialization was a mess, right?
Right.
We had, like, even within democratic countries, we had really grim class conflict and really brutal conditions a lot of the time, and it gave rise to some nasty corruption. Meanwhile, on the global level, the antipathy to the hard bargain of that factory labor had to sign up for produced the socialist idea and the dream that we could get rich without having to go through this brutal intermediate stage. And that then yielded totalitarian communism and the Cold War, and brought us to the verge of nuclear annihilation. So we have been flirting with disaster for but completely expectedly so, right? We're making this stuff up as we go along. So we surmounted those challenges. We overcame the great totalitarian challenges of the 20th century, and breathed a big sigh of relief there in the 90s, thinking we were in the end of history.
Right.
But no, it was just getting, catching its breath. And we're right back in the middle of the thick of historical, agonies again. And I think we're caught between one great world historical triumph, the conquest of poverty, and the possible next great world historical triumph, the translation of mass plenty into mass flourishing. But where we are right now is unsatisfactory. But so all the problems I talk about in the permanent problem are real ones that vex people and that really tragically mar their lives. Obesity is one of them. And so on the one hand, what a shame, that here we are, we're rich, we have better access to healthy and nutritious foods than any human beings have in history. And so what do? We stuff our faces with junk, and 40% of us are obese. So that shows that we're not taking full advantage of our freedom and of our opportunities. We're going for quick dopamine hits over our long-term good, and that's kind of sad. Meanwhile, technology rides to the rescue with Ozempic, so maybe we'll solve that one. But there are a lot of other problems that I think are they're great problems to have. They're the problems of being a rich society. So I would never, curse this time and wish for the glory days of days gone by. There was no golden age. This is, I think, the best time to live ever, and we have more opportunities to make good lives for ourselves than ever before. But we do have real problems and real obstacles, and we have wandered off course, I think, in important ways. But that's what free societies do. They learn, they adapt, they reinvent themselves. So we're in stubbing our toe, getting bruises and stuff, but we're in a learning process right now.
We are, and in reading, the two main concepts, of course, that are associated with it would be the captured economy and the permanent problem, right? And since we started on this initial path, I am fascinated by talking about the permanent problem, right? I was always, as a child, fascinated with the premise of Star Trek, Gene Roddenberry's science fiction masterpiece in some ways. And it always struck to me that in his future vision of society, the concept of money, the concept of poverty had been completely erased. And in doing so, humanity replaced their pursuit of material wealth and of eliminating poverty with, we now have to explore the stars, and because that's what gives us as a species some sort of goal to
Right.
look towards. Do you kind of maybe think that's what we need? I mean, ironically enough, we do have the specter or the exciting prospect of space exploration before us, where it's very a possible, maybe not in our lifetimes, but it's a possibility that in the next generation we'll live to see a colony on Mars, say, or certainly moon bases that we probably will see very soon. Um, how do you think about that? Do you think in some ways the pursuit of the elimination of poverty has really spurred us, and that's like the booster rocket stage, and now humanity as a whole needs to have some other collective goal to move towards?
Yeah, we have to. This is the challenge. And even more than the developments in spaceflight, the developments in AI are really shoving this right under our nose right now, with the
Yes.
prospect of automating. We've already figured out how to automate most of the things we can do with our bodies, and now we're about to figure out how to automate all the things we can do with our noggins. So that means that puts a real existential question before us, which is, what do you do when you don't have to do anything, right? So this question of purpose was not one that troubled the overwhelming majority of most people throughout most of human existence. Their goal was to get food, shelter, and clothing, and that was a full-time job, right? And often not fully successful.
The
But
existential stuff
now,
was left to the philosophers, right? That's where you got your classic philosophical thinking. It was a select few that sat and thought about what are we doing here? What's our purpose? What do we do? Right? That was not a
that's right.
mass. That was not a question for the masses. That was a question
That's
for
right.
a very select few people, right?
And I would say also for Star Trek, we just see the tiny minority of people who are on starships and on star bases. There's
Right.
there's billions and billions of people just hanging out on planets. I don't know exactly what they're doing, but that's the beauty of fiction. You can just skip over the tough questions altogether.
Right.
So I just in my I was a boy during the Apollo missions. That was the great enthusiasm of my childhood. So I'm thrilled this week with the return to the moon after a half century. Look forward to have been thrilled by the dramatic progress in reducing launch costs by 90%.
Yes.
That SpaceX has achieved through reusability. I hope to see that push forward further with Starship. So I think all that's great, and I maintain my childhood faith that our destiny is in the stars. That if we just stay here, if we stay here, our population is going to run up against some sort of limit that we don't want to grow any farther than that. And I feel we'll just grow inward, and it will be very easy for us to. And we're already seeing this. Maybe the path of least resistance is just to put all our energies into information technology, and then just sort of disappear into virtual worlds, just sort of disappear up our own navels, and rather than extend outward into the cosmos. So I want the human story to go as long and be as varied and have as many different chapters and many different variations as conceivable. And I don't
Right.
think that destiny can be achieved just on one planet. So over the longer term, that's my hope, is that I think a Homo sapiens that doesn't, at least colonize the solar system and try its level best to get out there, among the stars, will have to be graded as an underachiever.
And to the extent that I agree with you, humanity just has to have an overriding goal, or people, rather, I should say, should have an overriding goal. Do you feel how, like, for me, you mentioned AI as well, right? And that is, again, in some ways, I view it as just another technological advance that causes a shift in employment patterns and accessibility and things of that nature. That's where I do fall back on the free market and free market economics that say, people as a whole will figure it out. Yes, some people will go through change or be inconvenienced or put out, or just like the Industrial Revolution and
Sure.
other technological advances. So that doesn't concern me as much. What does concern me is, what do we do with ourselves, much like what you described. And I've always had faith that it would fall back on creativity. The poets, the artists, the songwriters, the playwrights, whatever, that if I don't have to worry about where my next, because we always had the concept of the starving artist, right? To be a truly great artist, you had to suffer, you had to go through something, you sacrificed for your art. If you don't have to sacrifice for your art, I've always thought that, like, as AI frees me from a 9 to 5 job and I can still eat somehow, then I might be more like, oh, do I write the next great play, the next Shakespearean novel, whatever? Do you feel that's the case, or do you feel that also will now tie into your captured economy, meaning that there are forces that will prevent us from going down that path?
Yeah. So in my book, I talk about sort of three crises that capitalist societies are undergoing now. The first is what I call the crisis of inclusion, which is this sort of weakening connection between economic growth and overall well-being. So we continue to grow richer. The material comforts and conveniences and diversions keep piling up, but a number of important indicators of well-being are flashing red and going in the wrong direction. So that's disconcerting, and shows, I think, that we don't live by bread alone. Meanwhile, there is a subsidiary crisis of the actual capacity of the capital system to keep producing economic growth has been sputtering. Sputtering in the United States, growth in the 21st century is down markedly from the average growth rates of the 20th century. But the U.S. is the economic superstar of the advanced economic democracies world. So years of outright stagnation are becoming more and more normal in other advanced economies. So we've got a real problem of slowing growth, slowing productivity growth, growing barriers to particularly growing barriers to change that requires rearrangements of atoms at large scale, right? So we've continued to zoom down technological progress in the IT field, where it's tiny and frictionless, and we all want to live as long as possible. So we're still quite sanguine about medical innovation. But innovation out there in the world, mastering the forces of nature to bend the physical forces out in the world to do our bidding, and creating large structures. We've almost forgotten how to do that over the past 50 years. So one giveaway is we called ourselves developed countries, right? So we're done, right? The developing countries come catch up with us. And from that point forward, we basically made it very difficult to build anything new. The footprints of our large cities kind of got stabilized, and we didn't want to allow disruption. It was just too much hassle. So there's been a lot of sclerosis that has grown up, and that needs to be fought. And a part of that sclerosis is this, is the power of insiders who have through market competition gotten to a favored position and now want to lock it in, right? They don't want to compete anymore. So and so the richer a country gets, the more people there are who have a big stake in the status quo. They're comfortable with it. The richer a country gets, the lower communication costs go. So the easier it is to organize with other people who have a vested interest in the status quo. And so Mansfield Olson, an economist back in the 70s, had this theory that peace and prosperity were bad for economic dynamism because over time you would build up these vested interest barnacles that would make it harder and harder to keep the ship moving forward. And that's the dynamic that Steve Tellis and I wrote about in the book, The Captured Economy, which is that the sort of powerful insiders using their dominant position within the policymaking process to tilt the table in their favor, and particularly to keep out new entrants and to throttle competition. And so to simultaneously slow down growth by throttling competition and worsen inequality by redistributing income and wealth up the socioeconomic scale. So that's a major challenge that all rich countries face, and it's deeper than a policy challenge. It is, I think, a cultural challenge, which is this psychological trait at the individual level of loss aversion. It hurts worse to lose something you have than to not get something that you thought about maybe you would get. So those lost hypothetical gains don't sting like something that was in your hands and now you don't have it anymore. And so the more you got, the more you focus your energy on hanging on to what you have, even at the cost of foregoing more. And I think that has scaled up collectively to the kind of vetocracy that we see, being a stumbling block for progress in one area after another. So that's we're coming to grips with this being a real problem. We've got an abundance movement that has started up on the center left, and a progress movement that started up on the center right that are taking direct aim at this problem. So I think there's some hopeful signs there, but it's a big challenge.
So yeah, and I'm sorry for trying to interrupt you, but I, as you talked about it, so why would this be different than something that, say, as a young man, I was inspired by Milton Friedman, and he would say, like, look, what Brink just described here is a failure of government, right? It's that any monopoly that's existed has always existed for extended periods of time, has existed only because of government intervention. That once you get to this position of plenty, this position of market dominance, they go to government to seek and petition the government to build their moats and to prevent competition, right? So here comes John, and I'll say, like, so Brink, why does this cause an existential crisis for you? Isn't it more a crisis of execution, that our government is not following the tenets that we think it should be following, that it's, hey, let's change the policy. Maybe I'm being simplistic here. And here's the thing, like, the free market then would then take over. That let's get away from this mercantilist out view of life, that this, blah, 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 and let the free market work. It sounds to me, you're not there. You're not there, right? You're not, you're not.
I'm pretty close to there. I'm pretty close to there.
Are you?
So,
okay.
Yeah. So, I mean, as opposed to my, Cato Institute days, I will grant a much more considerable role to government in being a facilitator of and stimulator of scientific and technological progress. Of course, there's enormous public funding for scientific research. There's lots of scientific research that will have great long-term benefits that will yield no profitable opportunities for anybody in the here and now. So there is a at least a prima facie case that the public sector can improve upon private sector outcomes by supporting scientific research. There's been government as a purchaser has been a big stimulator of technological progress from from you know letting airlines carry the mail, and of course, just the huge subsidy to aircraft development from the military, right? Just the spillover effect. So, and that in America in particular, our industrial policy has mostly been spinoffs from our military efforts, but those spinoffs have been considerable, including the internet. So that started as a Defense Department project. So as opposed to my hardcore libertarian days, I will say that there's a mix of that government doesn't just, it really needs to get out of the way once market participants are doing the trial and error process of figuring out how to innovate and how to convert new technologies into commercial products that make people's lives better in a way they want to pay for. Yes, stay out of the way of that. In earlier stages, I see constructive contributions the government can make that
Right.
my old self might have disagreed with, but still in the part that we're talking about, in the captured economy. So that's pretty much of a free market rule book, playbook that I'm calling plays out of, and in general for the crisis of dynamism, as I call it. Yes, I think we need greater state capacity and as well as a more dynamic private sector, but a more dynamic, more competitive private sector is a big part of the problem. So
Right.
to me, it's the crisis of inclusion, this kind of breakdown of the relationship between growth and flourishing that's much more puzzling for libertarians. What do you do about this growing class divide between the well-educated and everybody else, which then spills out into our ugly dysfunctional politics? So those problems, I've had to go, and think outside of my, Hayekian background. But for what's wrong with the economy, I still am making lots of use of the old playbook.
Right. Okay. And something you just mentioned, which is kind of an interesting topic related to all this, you mentioned um, that a lot of as we go forward, there's an interesting, in my opinion, dichotomy, right? That as AI progresses, and as you said, we're automating now how we think, not just how we automate what we do with our bodies physically, but just how we think. We're entering that science fiction age that you and I grew up on, the science fiction where you had talking androids and computers, and right, we're living our Star Trek right now in
Yep.
a lot of ways, right? Um, what do we do with folks who are cognitively incapable of participating in that revolution? For now, let's say we've taken away the issue of education, that it's not a matter of education. The same way I will never be a great painter, that I just don't have that innate ability. There will be people who cannot keep up as our society becomes less and less dominated in the physical aspect of things. Have you considered that? Like, how does that play into what you're talking about?
Yeah. So if AI plays out like some anxious forecasts these days say it will, which is that it's going to automate a whole lot of white collar knowledge work, and therefore kind of drag down the economic prospects of a whole lot of people whose what used to be their career path is now something machines can do. While at the same time empowering some, I think, smaller subset of workers to be dramatically more productive than ever before and probably more highly remunerated than ever before. That to me sounds like an extension of a dynamic that's been going on for since the dawn of mass affluence, since we achieved industrialization and started moving into this post-industrial service-oriented information age economy. And what that so on the one hand, that was a humanitarian triumph. So technological progress was no longer dependent upon huge inputs of brute physical labor under dirty and dangerous conditions, right? So for all through industrialization, progress had a blood price, right? There were hundreds of thousands of people maimed every year in industrial accidents. This was not easy stuff. It was just hard work. and dangerous work and brutalizing work under kind of military discipline and conditions, you know? So, and now we figured out how to let machines do all that dirty, dangerous work, and we converted people, you know, from factory hands into office workers. So on the material level and on the physical level, a triumph. But what this meant was that technological progress, the progress of the system, was no longer as dependent as before on the contributions of ordinary workers. So
Yes.
that means that the contributions of ordinary workers today are just existentially less important than those in the past. In the past, factory workers stood at the technological frontier shoulder to shoulder with their bosses in the same companies, in the same buildings. And they were the people who were making the world go forward. When there was a steel strike, you know, that was a threat not only to the economy, but it was a threat to global security, right? Because it was a threat to American industrial might, and American industrial might was the guarantor of the freedom of the world. So the power and importance of ordinary workers back then was immense, and everybody knew it. All right, so socialism said that the ordinary worker, the proletarian, was the protagonist of world history, and socialism was doing well enough in market share that the capitalist countries had to, you know, up their game as far as saying, no, we're better for you workers than socialism ever will be.
Right.
So, and that is gone now, right? So the ordinary workers today have much better working conditions and they're better paid, but their work is less important, and therefore the social status that they occupy as a result of their work is degraded substantially. And so we've seen a kind of a steady marginalization of people and places by economic progress. And those people and places that feel left behind feel resentful. And then when there's cultural cleavages that open up between the left behind and the masters of the universe, that exacerbates the problem. And then you get a populist uprising like we've had today. Our populist uprising is because the people who are sort of least articulate, least capable of organizing, are so disenchanted with the way our established institutions and governing elites are operating that they're willing to take a flyer on crazy demagoguery, right? They've just lost all faith in the establishment. So that's when the least articulate and least organizable sections of society are fed up. What happens if AI does the same kind of marginalization to highly educated managers and professionals? Then we're going to see some serious social instability. So
Right.
I can picture the way the social consequences of AI leading us to a head to this idea that that basically right now we've got a world where 20 to 30% of people are I would say have better conditions for flourishing, for fully developing their capacities and exercising their capacities and experiencing the satisfactions that come from that. So 20 to 30% of the people at the top of society, the managers, professionals, entrepreneurs, they have the best conditions for flourishing that any large group of people in any society has ever experienced ever.
Right.
But everybody else is kind of on the outside looking in, and because their work experience it doesn't give them the autonomy, it doesn't give them the intellectual challenges, it doesn't have the career track that gives structure to your working life. It's not competitive to get into, so there's no status associated with having that job. The pay isn't very good. So they're not getting flourishing on the job. And meanwhile, outside the job, the number one, foundation for happy lives is strong personal relationships. And we're seeing real disintegration of social connection. And that disintegration is happening most virulently outside of the managerial and professional elite. So those people are really getting hammered. I think ultimately, what we're seeing, what I've come around to thinking, is that mass employment is a phase in history. It's not the end state. So, uh, this idea of the separation of work and life, right? Work-life balance, right?
Right.
That's a relatively new idea. So once upon a
Yes.
time, the home was the workplace. Everybody was farmers. Then we started to separate off. First, men go off to factories, then women follow into offices and shops. But and that really peaked in the early 1980s. Around 1980, only about 2% of Americans said that the home was their primary workplace. Now, thanks to IT, with people being able to work remotely, um, and the growth of smaller scale businesses, and then thanks to the accelerant of the COVID experience, about 20% of people now work from home. So I so what does a bright future look like? One version of a bright future is everybody's got an awesome job that pays really well, and is intellectually rewarding, and that's the path we have been trying to go down for the past couple of decades, trying to ram everybody through college, make everybody into a knowledge worker, and it just doesn't really work. It's now, I think, it's watered down college so that it's really lost a great deal of its intellectual rigor, and everybody can't be a knowledge worker, and probably, especially with AI coming, it's even probably less available of a dream than it was before. So my dream is that we keep pushing technology aggressively enough to lower the cost of living to the point where more and more of us can be independently wealthy, where we can. So people who have the human capital, have the particular skills that the market rewards at that juncture. There's still going to be capitalism. There's still going to be large scale enterprises doing, particularly pushing the technological frontier forward. There's still going to be a large number of people, working intensely and intensively, and getting a lot of, intrinsic rewards from this kind of intellectually challenging work. So that's all great. But I think for a lot of other people, work will be a phase of life, like school is a phase of life for us now. So retire in your 30s, or maybe work like only 15 hours a week, which is what John Maynard Keynes thought we would be doing by now in the essay that gave us the phrase "the permanent problem," or work episodically over the course of your life as circumstances change. So, but you would have a kind of conscious control and volition over when you entered and exited the workplace that just doesn't apply to
Right.
most people now, and that then would make the work experience feel very differently than it does when it's kind of this involuntary precarity that you find yourself in all the time. So that's where I aim in the permanent problem. Is we want a longer term future, where more and more where paid work is mass mobilization into paid employment isn't the norm anymore, and more people spend their free time in smaller face-to-face communities, that's what gives us, for the most part, the sustenance that for most of us is the meat and potatoes of a good life, is strong relationships with other people. So living in communities, building our own communities with robots and AI help, but doing it on our own and having a degree of self-sufficiency as kind of a hobby, like we convert gardening and hunting into hobbies. We can convert community building into our hobby that we do with other people and connects us to them, gives relationships a practicality that they don't have anymore, and so we can have a kind of active life, but outside of the cash nexus, going into participating in the cash nexus whenever we want to, and of course all of our prosperity ultimately supported by and propelled forward over time by ongoing capitalist innovation.
Yeah, and it's as you were describing that, I was thinking of just the sort of change in just our lifetimes. I'm saying I'm making an assumption that you and I are roughly the same age and have lived the same generational experiences. So, I remember, for example, the concept of being fulfilled at work, or or the phrase "I'm not happy at work," that never existed in our parents' generation.
No, no.
And for the most part, our formative years, you would never have heard a phrase like that, right? It was always like you worked in order to eat. You worked in order to put a roof over your head. It wasn't you didn't get fulfillment from your job for most people, for the overwhelming
Right,
majority of people, right?
right.
Um, that fulfillment came from personal relationships, family. It may have come from a religious institution, or it may have come from some sort of philosophical organization, right? Like,
Yeah,
whatever, Stoicism or the Stoics or whatever, right? And what I saw initially when the internet came, formulated in the public, not the ARPANET days, but later, when it became a more personal experience, we saw a lot of people forget we saw the initial rise of internet communities, the Well being one of the more famous ones,
first
right?
one. Yeah,
And people found that I think that community that you just described initially in these really formative years of the internet, like the message boards and whatever, and those were close knit communities. Everyone knew each other, both in the physical world and the online world. So, do you think this is a cyclical thing? The same way right now, I might advise my nephew and my son to say, stay away from knowledge and service businesses. Those are in too much upheaval for your generation. Stick to being a plumber or an
right.
electrician, and own your own business where your labor still matters to people, and you might be able to get some fulfillment that way. Do you think it's cyclical that their children will be like, no, no, what? Why aren't we building virtual worlds or figuring out how to open up a burger shop on the moon or something? Right?
Yeah, I mean, it is generally the case that today's solutions beget tomorrow's problems,
Right.
and today's successes look like tomorrow's failures. So I'm sure there's a considerable amount of of there will be considerable amount of cyclicality in what's fashionable and what's fulfilling. But there's constants as well. So I think the way I talk about it in the book at the individual level, I think that you can divide things in different ways, but I say there's three sort of primary avenues for flourishing. There's projects, there's things you do in the world that are of interest to you and of value to other people. Uh, those could be your projects, could be your employment, they could be hobbies, they could be community things you do in the community, whatever. And then relationships, and for most people, that's absolutely the that's the determinant of whether they had a happy life or not, is the quality of their relationships. And then finally, experiences. Just we're all lottery winners. We got born. We get to
Yes.
open our eyes and ears and just take in the wonders that the world has to offer. And all of these interrelate, right? So relationships can be lifelong projects, and big projects can bring you into relationships with other people, and of course those will give you experiences that you savor. And then we're all different, right? Some people are so into their projects that they can have a fairly thin social life and be fulfilled by that. Other people just have to be enmeshed
Right.
in human relationships, and their projects are something to while away the time. And then some people are just have great capacity to cultivate gourmet experience and just know how to have fun and how to enjoy things and how to find the joy in things better than other people. Um, so I think there's great individual variation along some very basic themes. Uh, you know, uh, we've talked already about the inversion that once upon a time, poor people were skinny and rich people were fat, and now it's
Right.
inverted. Once upon a time, the poorer you were, the longer the hours you worked, and now that's inverted. We've actually seen an increase with a general secular decline in lifetime hours worked overall, society wide, since the early days of industrialization through the present. Uh, Still, average weekly hours for top earners have actually gone up since the 70s as people, as this kind of, high powered knowledge work became, workaholism isn't just being a drone worker bee, right? There's an intoxication to the thrill of the intellectual challenge and to the stakes involved. There's If you're doing it for a lot of money, then you feel like you're doing something for high stakes, and a lot of people are counting on you, and so that's energizing and captivating, and so people get sucked up in it. And that's awesome, right? It's awesome to have so things that are so involving that you need people to tell you back off and smell the roses, right? So,
Right.
um, so I think there are and but the trick is going to be to find. I don't think our current institutional setup of where most people spend most of their waking hours of most of their adulthood working for somebody else for pay. I don't think that's probably the long-term institutional, uh, end game. I think we're going to move past that because it's not capable of delivering the satisfactions that people want, and so we're going to find more satisfactory institutional arrangements. If they're along the lines that I speculate about, that'll be cool for me. I called it. If
Right.
not, no shock. Predictions are
Right.
hard, especially about the future. But I do think that we know that a lot of people are not living nearly as high quality lives as they could be because of the paucity of real flesh and blood human connection that people used to just fall into naturally. And the reason
Right.
people used to fall into it naturally is because those flesh and blood face to face relationships fulfilled vital practical functions, right?
Yes.
Your spouse was your partner in economic production. Your kids worked on the farm and they took care of you when you were old. Your neighbors, they helped you out again if bad guys were coming. You were a mutual aid society. They were an insurance policy in tough times, and they were the only entertainment alternative to listening to the crickets at night. It was hanging out with them, right? So,
Right.
as we've gotten richer, we've grown less and less dependent on those face-to-face relationships for urgent practical needs. We've outsourced them to the market or to the welfare state. But we still have an urgent long-term need for important people in our life, and we've kind of forgotten about that. So we're going to have to, figure out new institutional ways of creating environments where we connect with each other naturally and easily.
Yeah, and it's interesting as you were saying that. I recall seeing a documentary rather, a couple of years ago that tied in what you're describing to the demise of bowling in the United States.
Right.
Because in the 50s and 60s, when you had spare time, bowling alleys and bowling leagues flourished because it was a place you got together with your friends, you spent a couple of hours, maybe you had a drink or two, you were engaging in a competitive sport or activity, and that as bowling disappeared, as those leagues disappeared due to working more hours, but in exchange for material gain, that's when you see sort of these societal disruptions, the
Yep.
the incel growth right now, right, and things of that nature. How much do you think? You mentioned institutions a couple of times. How much do you think that our current let's face it, especially, I think most of the world, but especially in the United States, there's no trust in institutions anymore. There's no trust that government is going to do the right thing by us, that we can expect them to do the right thing. There's not even trust that they'll leave us alone for us to figure out what's best for ourselves, right? So even if I were to take the extreme, not extreme because that would be anarchy, but say the classic libertarian position of just leave me alone, I'll figure it out, right?
Right.
Uh, we're not those people have no trust that that'll happen, and from the other end of the political spectrum, there's no trust from, say, the big government nanny state people that, all right, even if we gave government all this power, we trust them to know enough to do what's right for me, for us, right? So at some point in the last, I would say, 25, 30 years maybe, that trust has declined. Trust in
Markedly.
institutions, what's it like 15%, 20% of the people think trust the government to do the right thing. So when you use the word institutions a lot, one thinks of government right away, but do you also include things like organized religion or universities or things
Sure.
of that
Yes.
nature?
Yes. Anything. any scheme for human cooperation that has some kind of super personal life, right? That goes past the immediate principles that got involved at that time, right? That
Mhm.
it's got some staying power. It's been institutionalized, right? Some practice has been institutionalized. So yeah, the decline in social capital. Robert Putnam was a sociologist. He wrote the book Bowling Alone, that's saying that more people bowl than ever now. He wrote this in the 90s, except they bowl alone. They don't bowl in leagues anymore, right? So, and you can point to a number of ways in which we got materially better off, and that has sort of impinged upon our natural abilities to socialize. So AC got us all off the front porch and inside, right? We used to hang out on the front porch and see our neighbors. And then TV kept us inside and glued inside, right? So, and Putnam, when he's sort of looking around for suspects of what has diminished our connectedness and social capital, he says the number one villain is television. And now, once upon a time, television was family hour, right? You got one tube, everybody watches it together. Now everybody's hived off watching little phone screens all by themselves, and so the more and more ingenious people are able to come up with things that are incredibly diverting to do all by yourself, staring at a screen, then the more temptations there are we have to overcome before we can actually fulfill our human nature as hypersocial animals and start reaching out and connecting with people. As far as institutional trust is concerned, yes, it has been in long-term decline, and I would like to see I think a lot of this so why has it happened? So some of it is dramatic failures by elites. The 21st century has been replete with from Katrina to the financial crisis to the Iraq and Afghanistan occupation messes, all the way to baseball steroids, scandal, the Catholic Church child abuse scandal. One institution after another in the 21st century, showed that it's feet of clay and did its level best to alienate people. Meanwhile, so that's going on. But I would say if you went back in time, elites have been screwing things up pretty royally all along.
Right.
But our media environment now is one that is, much more unforgiving of elite error than that in the past. In the old days, the elites controlled all the official information. They controlled the story. They controlled what people knew. And so they could keep their blunders to themselves much more effectively than today. So that has changed. And then I think we have maybe just lost our capacity to trust as and here I will kind of blame the sort of the dumbing down of political discourse through electronic media, first through TV and then through sound, then now to internet memes and to social media, that we have a politics that's much more based on just split-second emotional reaction and snark and putting down the other side than any kind of reasoned deliberation. So we're just universes away from the Lincoln Douglas debates where people would just stand for hours on end listening to flowery orations, right? So a lot has gone on to undermine trust in big institutions, but I'm inclined to think that these kind of big mass institutions were a feature of a mass age, and that they're going to get overhauled as we enter into a new era, and that trust is probably going to have to get rebuilt from the bottom up, and we're going to have to create small scale organizations where they're face to face, and we know so everybody feels much better about about their life than they do about what's going on in the country. They feel better about their town than they do about the country. They like their member of Congress. They hate Congress, right? So there's a people are much more trusting of the familiar. But now we're in this world where absolute strangers are in our face all the time on social
Right.
media, right? So we're in an environment that's harder to trust people than before. So we're going to have to rebuild those things, but I suspect we're going to have new institutions that build up trust, and they're going to have to confederate up to larger scale structures.
Yeah, I sort of agree with you, but I wonder how long that a process that will take, whether it's something that's say in a generation or two, because I one of the examples I use is I used when I was young and in my William F. Buckley conservative days, and I mean really young, right? Like say early high school, right? Um, I would read the New York Times and derisively refer to it as Pravda West because I didn't like their political viewpoint and what their editors had to say. But I never once doubted that what they would purport was fact was indeed fact.
Right,
So you would read the Science Times and someone will say, "Oh, I thought you didn't like the New York Times." Yeah, but the Science Times, for someone who's studying to be a biologist, you read the Science Times and you trusted
right,
what they put down. And back then, that was where your mistrust was. Like, oh, not the fact, but the wrapper, the
right.
editor or the writer would put it in, right? Today, no one trusts anything to even be a fact. I mean, we saw it with COVID.
Yep,
We see it with AI. We see it with our skirmishes, whether it's in Iran or Afghanistan or wherever, Israel, whatever, Gaza. Like the facts themselves are no longer trustworthy. So when we get to this level of the thing I'm staring at, if I look at January 6th playing out in front of me and 90% of the people can't at least agree on the facts of what happened that day. Forget the motivations and the conspiracies, but just what we saw in front of our faces. Brink, is that something that's recoverable in our lifetimes, or within a generation or two? Will our children have that be able to recover to trust at least the facts before their faces?
good question. Right.
Hmm,
So I get gloomy now and again. I always I think hope is a moral obligation, but optimism, pessimism, those are empirical
right.
assessments, and I'm pessimistic about the near to medium term future, at least politically, and but I think back, that there were just, I think, significantly sturdier grounds for absolute despair in the 30s than there are today, right? So if we made it through that, then we can make it through this sort of this we can make it through this. But I agree that I think I think we're over the next few decades, we're playing for very high stakes that we could get. I keep talking about this hopeful future where things work out and we develop new institutions that are conducive to flourishing, but it may not go that way at all. Things may get a lot worse. And, a society of kind of post-literate people who don't even have a principled understanding of limited government or the rule of law. And
Right.
just doesn't make any sense, right? It's just too abstract. And they don't trust each other. They have no common reality that they can agree on. That's just not the recipe for a politically free society. So it's easy to picture that just devolving into autocracy. And so I think the path of least, that could happen, right? And the path of least resistance to me right now is that we move towards ever starker inequality, where a group of sort of highly privileged, super rich people live like gods, and the populace is sedated with electronic bread and circuses,
Right.
and sort of, distracted from the lousiness of the physical world by the frictionless oohs and ahs of the virtual world. and that could be a stable, awful equilibrium. That basically the more or less the Brave New World, scenario,
Mm.
where people are degraded and enslaved through their pleasures rather than through exploiting their fears, as was the case in 1984. So that's possible, and right now I think it's easier to picture ending up there than picturing a renaissance of trust and reconnection, right? So,
Mm.
but ultimately, I'm still enough of I am a liberal of some type or another. I believe in the primacy of the individual, which means I believe in a free society where people can choose, to live their own lives as they see fit. And so that means I think people, deserve to be free, and which means that they're capable of being free without messing everything up, you know, uh, irredeemably. So that's the test right now, where we have freed ourselves. Our wealth has freed us from all kinds of necessities. And are we going to exercise these enormous choices we have to, be all that we can be, to develop all our capacities and realize them and flourish and push the world forward in dazzling, wonderful ways? Are we just going to sink into, addiction and pettiness? Hey, it's tune in. We'll see how the movie goes. But the point is that we're all the writers and directors as well as the actors in this movie. So it's our call.
Yep, that's a great way to put it. Actually, we're both the directors and the actors of this movie. All right, Brink Lindsey, thank you so much for this opportunity to talk with you. I really enjoyed our conversation. But we're at the point now where I call this segment the final five. These are just five rapid fire questions just to give
Okay.
folks more of an understanding of you rather than the issues we talked about. So here we go. The first question: what's a completely non political, non intellectual hill you're willing to die on, and why does it matter so much to you?
Non-political, non-intellectual hill. Ugh. Yeah, yeah. I've got goofy grammar Nazi kinds of kinds of fetishes that I will protect, but that fits in the intellectual realm. Um, uh, oh, uh, um, yeah, I'll be an old. Yeah, I'll be old and say that when that too much money and too much talent has made organized sports much less wonderful than they were when I was younger. That when athletes could smoke during halftime and sell used cars in the off season, uh, that I liked that game better than this one. Where they get injured every other week because they're so strong and so fast that their collisions, bodies just can't put up with it. So I'll be a grumpy old man and long for the good old days of sports gone by. How about that?
Yeah, that old image of Len Dawson at halftime during the Super Bowl with a cigarette and a Fresca was
Yeah,
iconic. So I,
fantastic. Yes.
I kind of, I kind of get what you mean there. Okay, what's a piece of art, music, book, or film that consistently gets past all your intellectual armor and makes you feel something raw, disproportionate, or perhaps even a little embarrassing?
Oh, so Beethoven Symphony Number 9. I discovered that when I was like 13 or 14. I was just taking German, and so I learned the words to the chorus in the choral finale at that time. And for a year or two, I would listen to it every single day, and so it's just in my soul. I listen to classical music while I work, just as kind of
Right.
background music. But if that comes on, I have to make a decision. I'm either going to turn it off or switch to another station because or I'm just going to have to just spend the next 45 minutes closing my eyes and reliving that. And every few months, I will do that again. So
Okay,
that one has total power over me.
fantastic. That was a great answer. If someone makes a brick Brink Lindsey action figure. What accessory comes in the box? A policy memo, a contrarian essay, a half-finished manuscript, or just a complete look of disappointment?
What comes with him is an enormous library of books he's going to read someday. It's,
Okay, so it's just a huge unread library. Okay.
yes.
Uh, what do you believe now, in the here and now, that perhaps your younger self would say, there's no way I would ever believe that?
Yeah. So I'm in many ways just a preposterous messenger for the message of my book, right? I spent my whole life, celebrating capitalism and the free market, and now I'm talking about that our highest and best destiny is to kind of to at least gradually graduate from it. And I'm in this book, I'm talking about the central importance of face-to-face personal relationships. And I'm an introverted bookworm who's now living 9,000 miles away from most everybody I know and care about. So I never in a million years, me 20 years ago would never have pictured me writing this book.
All right. Excellent. And the final question. If Milton Friedman and John Maynard Keynes were arguing at the bar, and you had to buy a drink for one of them just to shut them up, which one and why?
Well, I had the pleasure of meeting Milton Friedman. It was at a conference in Mexico City, and actually we were going to a dinner, and we had to go on a bus to go to someone's beautiful home. It was like an hour bus ride up into the hills, and I got to sit next to Milton Friedman. And I'd been at the Cato Institute for about a month, so I was in my 20s, and he was my idol, and I got to sit with him for a solid hour. So since I've check that one off the bucket list, I'll talk up Keynes, since I will take this advantage of time travel to go back and talk to him, pick his brain.
Fantastic. That's a great anecdote right there. All right, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Brink Lindsey, my guest, thank you so much for your insights and your time. Please, is there a book or a website or a Substack or something you'd like to mention for the folks out there?
Sure, you can read the book, The Permanent Problem, The Uncertain Transition from Mass Plenty to Mass Flourishing. That was an outgrowth of the Substack that I write called The Permanent Problem. That's easy, accessible, and free. So dive in there, and if you like that, buy the book.
Fantastic. I'm sure a lot of people will if they haven't already. All right. Until next time, this has been the Big Questions with Big John. I'm Big John. Hit the subscribe button, smash the like button to help us out with the YouTube algorithm. Until next time, peace, everyone.